Is it possible to make a game look like a watercolor painting? What if your game world could flow and bloom like pigment on paper, with all the luminous glow and organic unpredictability that make watercolor so captivating? In this video, we're going to explore how to transform standard 3D rendering into something that feels hand-painted, capturing the essence of one of our most expressive artistic traditions. Watercolor works by mixing pigment with water, letting you spread it onto a surface, just as our prehistoric ancestors did on their stone walls. What makes watercolor so special? It is cheap, easy to start with, and fast. Perfect for sketching ideas or preparing for bigger works. Its transparency lets light shine through the pigment, giving it that signature luminous glowing quality. It captures color vividly, while also abstracting and simplifying, making it perfect for illustration. It's long been a favorite of nature artists, especially botanists. Since the Renaissance, it's been a favorite medium for capturing fleeting moments, from misty landscapes to radiant still lifes. Like drawing, watercolor is very personal, and we see an astonishing variety in how artists use washes, strokes, and blends to create their effects. A handful of games have embraced this aesthetic to stunning effect. Developers typically achieve watercolor visuals through three approaches: painted textures, perhaps animated in 2D layers; painted textures on 3D models; and post-process shaders to create the watercolor effect. The most compelling implementations often combine these approaches with specialized techniques to capture watercolor's distinctive character. By the end of this video, you'll be able to understand what makes watercolor look authentic, build a watercolor shader from scratch, and apply this watercolor effect to your games. Hi there, I'm Arman from GameLogic FX. In this video, we're diving into the delicate art of watercolor rendering, another technique that can transform your game's visuals from standard 3D to something that feels handcrafted and alive. I'll warn you from the beginning though, that this is a difficult technique to pull off, and we don't get all the way there with this video. If you want to use it for a commercial project, you will need to do a lot more work to get to the final result. But I hope this will give you a good and interesting starting point. If you're new here, this channel explores both classical and cutting-edge rendering techniques that can give your games that extra visual magic. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit subscribe and the notification bell to join our community of developers exploring the art and science of game effects. Oh, and leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and it's a great way for everyone in the community to learn from and inspire each other. What gives watercolor its unmistakable character? At its heart is transparency. Unlike opaque media, watercolor lets light penetrate through pigment layers and reflect off the paper beneath. Artists often leave lighter areas untouched, letting the paper itself create the highlights and glow. The paint dries fast, so the artist must move quickly. A lot of the painting process is about managing water. Pigment gathers in pools that shift and settle in unpredictable ways, creating soft edges and blooming textures. Pools that touch bleed into each other. And artists can get rich gradients by adding pigment or water as they move the blob across the paper. While we can't possibly recreate every nuance of watercolor painting in real-time graphics, we can capture its essential character by focusing on key elements that define the medium, especially those that are straightforward to implement in shaders. By focusing on these elements, we'll create a procedural system that gives us artistic control while maintaining that distinctive watercolor feel. We'll build a shader that models 5 fundamental aspects of watercolor. Edge-darkened washes, the characteristic darker edges where pigment accumulates. Non-uniform fills, the subtle variations in color density across a wash. Irregular borders, washes extend beyond the object boundaries with irregular organic edges. Layered transparency, the way colors build up through translucent layers. Subtractive mixing, how pigments blend using a subtractive rather than additive color model. We'll work on each aspect separately before assembling our complete watercolor effect. To understand why we make certain choices in the implementation of the steps, here is a diagram of how we will put it together when we are done. We split the image into layers, blur each one, and then feed both the original layers and their blurred copies to a shader that applies the wash transformations. Finally, we recombine all these process layers to achieve our watercolor look. In each step, the channels are processed independently and in the same way, so I'll explain the technique only in terms of intensity values for simplicity. Step 1. Create edge-darkened washes. Let's begin with perhaps the most distinctive feature of watercolor, the way pigment naturally accumulates at the edges of the wash, creating darker borders. If we start with a simple black circle as our input, we want to transform it so that the center becomes lighter, while the edges remain dark. While we could use complex algorithms like flat fills, which we explored in our outline video, we can achieve beautiful results with a much simpler approach. To see how it works, let's look at the graph representing the intensity of the image from the center of the blob to the edge. The hard edge creates a step function from black to white. When we blur this, the intensity on the left side of the graph is inversely proportional to the distance from the edge. In other words, there's a smooth transition from black to grey as one gets closer to the previous edge. The intensity in the right region is proportional to the edge, in other words, a smooth transition from grey to white. But we'll discard that part, so it's not important for our purposes. Now, we actually want the left side to be proportional, not inversely proportional to the distance from the edge. In other words, it must be dark towards the edge and lighter towards the center of the circle. So we need to invert the image. Now we need to mask out the part outside the original shape. To do this, we can use the inverted version of the original hard-edged image. Mathematically, we can represent the inversion like this. To make tweaking the fall off towards the edges a little easier, we need to normalize the inverted blur graph to values between -1 and 1. So, we simply multiply the intensity by 2 and subtract from 1. And now, when we multiply the result with our mask, the graph looks like this. Remember, we discard everything to the right of the edge. Using a power function lets us fine-tune the fall-off curve, controlling whether the wash darkens gradually or concentrates its intensity closer to the edge. We don't necessarily want pure white towards the center of the image, nor full intensity black at the edge, so we need to specify the maximum and minimum intensity of the wash. For this, we scale and offset the results so far. And finally, we add the inverse of the mask to make the background white again. So in this step, our inputs are the image, the kernel size of the blur, the power that determines the drop-off shapes, the minimum intensity, and the maximum intensity. Step 2. Adding non-uniform fill. Real watercolor washes are never perfectly uniform. The way water flows and pigment settles create subtle variations across even the flattest looking areas. To simulate this unevenness, we'll add some low-frequency noise. While developing, we will be using a 2D version of sine waves. Now we want to add this noise layer directly in the shader of the previous step. We need to offset the noise so that it is centered around 0. We do this because it will then both darken and lighten the wash when we add it. In addition, we want to control how much the noise affects the result, so we will also add the scaling parameter. Here's the final result with the noise added. We're getting very close to a nice watercolor effect. We don't want to use a different noise texture for each layer, but if we add all the layers just as they are, the noise will accumulate and dominate the image. One trick to help avoid this is to offset the noise for each layer. So in this step, we added the following inputs to our shader: the noise texture, the color noise scale, and a UV offset. Here is the result of this step with actual noise. I painted some tileable random white and black dots and blurred the result to create a noise layer for this example. Different noise types affect the texture of the wash. The subtle variation this creates instantly makes our washes feel more organic and hand-painted, catching the eye in the same way real watercolor does. Step 3. Creating irregular borders. One of watercolor's most distinctive characteristics is how artists can deliberately allow edges to bloom, feather and flow in unpredictable ways as the water carries pigment where it wants to go. Now let's make our shape less even to simulate this as well. We will make a mask by adding smooth noise to the inverted original image and then thresholding it. This slightly distorts the mask shape, but the original image is not everywhere where the mask lets it show through, so we actually need to add the noise to the original image as well. Although we could use the same noise to manipulate both the shape and intensity, we need different scaling parameters to control them independently. We therefore add a dedicated shape noise scaling parameter for fine-tuning just how irregular our watercolor edge becomes. Now look at what we've achieved so far. Compare this with a hand-painted blob. Not bad at all, even with 2 steps still to go. Of course, different noise types affect how the shape of the edge looks, from soft billowing borders to more granular textured edges. Step 4. Implementing layer transparency. The 4th step brings depth to our watercolor effect by separating the image into transparent layers. We'll use the same basic idea that we use for dithering and cross-hatching, quantizing the image, but with a difference. We want to separate the layers completely so that we can process them independently. We'll use a shader that applies a different threshold to the image to get each layer. When recombined, these layers give us the quantized image. Step 5. Implementing subtractive color mixing. The final step is to mix the different colors together. Computer graphics typically use additive color mixing, that is RGB, but transparent pigments use subtractive mixing, that is CMY, or cyan, magenta and yellow, like that used in printing. So for effect to work like watercolor, we also need to use subtractive mixing. We'll use the CMY color model because it maps more directly to RGB. In CMY, the primaries are cyan, magenta and yellow. Cyan and magenta make blue, cyan and yellow make green, and magenta and yellow make red. All the primaries mixed together make black. To implement this in our shader, we'll do the following. First, we convert the image to CMY by inverting it. In other words, subtracting each color component from one. In this form, the meaning of the channel values changes. The red channel represents the amount of cyan, the green channel the amount of magenta, and the blue channel the amount of yellow. Here are the CMY values for a few colors. The primary colors each have a 1 in the corresponding channel and zeros elsewhere. Pure secondary colors have 2 1s and a 0. These are the primaries in RGB. White has all zeros. This represents the blank page we used to paint on. Black has all 1s, an even mix of the 3 primaries. Then we add colors component-wise in this CMY color space, and it will represent the color as if it was mixed with pigment. Finally, before we render it, we need to convert it back to RGB again by inverting the sum. Let's go through examples to see how this works. Mixing cyan paint, which is 011 in RGB, and magenta paint, which is 101 in RGB, is supposed to make blue paint. We invert them into the CMY color space by subtracting each component from 1. We get 100 and 010. Adding these together gives us 110. Inverting this result to go back to the RGB color space gives us 001, which is blue, exactly what we expect. Light magenta paint with RGB 1/2 and dark green paint with RGB 0/2 are supposed to make black paint. If we invert them into the CMY color space, we get 0/2 and 1/2. Adding them gives us 111. Inverting this value to go back to RGB gives us 000, which is black, as we expect. Isn't that neat? So the whole process for subtractive color mixing is this. And we can simplify the formula. This is the same formula we used to mix grays in the cross-hatching video. Since the result was like multiplication, we can use the same trick here. Here are some mixing charts that show how the colors mix. Putting it all together. Now let's assemble our complete watercolor effect. While our approach isn't optimized for maximum performance, we'll address that later, it clearly demonstrates how all these elements work together. We'll implement our effect as a post-process in Unity. We have 4 shaders. The layer shader is applied to the image with different thresholds to separate out the transparent layers. The blur shader is applied to each of these layers. The wash shader combines the original layer image with the blur image to implement steps 1 to 4 in our effect. For this shader, we need to set up various parameters depending on the layer. Finally, the mix shader mixes all the colors together, implementing step 5 of our effect. In many cases, we just want the layers to be sufficiently different, so we apply the golden ratio trick we mentioned in our cross-hatching video to some parameters. For example, we can use this to offset the noise. This creates pleasing variation without requiring manual tuning of each layer. Here's how the result looks with our scene, with different sets of parameters. 1 layer per channel, 2 layers per channel, 5 layers per channel, with some color transformations after processing, and with some color transformations before processing. By default, we adjust the wash strength based on the number of layers, but we can get interesting effects by making the value lower or higher. The watercolor effect also combines beautifully with other techniques we've explored in previous videos. Here we multiply the wash with a hatch texture, giving us colored hatching. Of course, all the UV displacement we used in monochromatic hatching can be used here too. Here we add an outline on top of the wash. Here we distort the outline using smooth noise for a more hand-drawn look. And here we hatch in one color on top of the washes. We can significantly alter the look with more color transformations. We can also do color transformations on the individual layers. Among other things, this allows us to paint with non-ideal primaries such as red instead of magenta and blue instead of cyan, as is traditional in art. Almost all the tips we mentioned in our previous videos on stylized rendering can be used when building the effects we looked at here. I'll just share a few tips specific to this effect. Step-by-step development. It is better to develop each step in its own shader first. It enables you to test and tweak the effect without the complexity of the rest of the implementation, simplifying the development. When you put everything together and start to optimize it, you'll have a reference against which you can check the full implementation. The components will also be useful to create other effects. If you keep them separate, it is easier to prototype new techniques that use them. Pro debugging. In the final setup, you will save a lot of time if you make it easy to see different aspects of the effect separately. You'll want to do this for any step, any layer, and any channel. It's a little extra effort, but this lets you isolate problems fast. All the steps are channel independent. This means that you need the channel filters only at the input. If you see unexpected color activity in a channel, you've likely found a bug. Besides the ramps, I also recommend that you use mixing circles and a mixing triangle texture to help you see how the mixing logic works. This is especially useful if you tweak the mixing logic and want to understand its effect. Use reference and rank features. When modeling a complex effect like watercolor, look at reference images to identify its main features and decide which ones you will implement to get as close as possible to the effect. Even if you want to implement all the features, you can rank them and implement them in the order of importance. This way, the full effect becomes a stretch goal, so that if you run out of time, you can use what you have. Get it to work first and optimize later. This effect has a lot going on. The unoptimized version calls graphics to split 15 times per frame. You might wonder if it wouldn't be better to merge more of the steps from the start. But in the early stages, so much is still unknown. How each part will look, which ones you will actually need, and how they'll fit together, and so on. That's why starting with a modular setup makes sense. It lets you plug and play, tweak things freely, and explore without breaking the whole pipeline. And there you have it. We've explored how to capture the feel of watercolor in real time, from edge-darkened washes with organic borders to layered subtractive colors. Combined with other techniques like cross-hatching and outlining, this opens the door to truly distinctive visual styles for your games. I hope this video inspires you to experiment with watercolor effects in your own projects. If you create something using any of these effects, please let us know in the comments. I would love to see what you make. As always, give us a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss out on future videos. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.